Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the African Infrastructure Futures Conference. Thank you, Paul. So just some context. Paul has just returned from Egypt, and I think after the loss and damages achievement, they were so desperate to find something to applaud for. He's going to applaud for any achievement. Wow, what an amazing thing it is to have everyone here. We're a little bit sort of spread out in the room, and that is because we've deliberately kept the numbers capped, because we wanted the discussions today, in particularly the parallel sessions, to be intimate and engaged, and for people to really have the space to talk to each other about their work. And as you would have seen outside, we've made sure that we've created the ambience for that. So I want to spend the next 20 minutes setting a bit of context for why we're here and what we're hoping to achieve over the next 3 days, and then include in that time some of the practicalities about how we're going to work together today, and then, of course, set the stage for our wonderful keynote speaker for this morning. So again, welcome to Cape Town, welcome to UCT. Fortunately, we erred on not putting up many of you in Khayelitsha. You may have heard on the news this morning because of a terrible protest around public transport policy in Cape Town. Most of the working class in the city can't get to work this morning, and much of the city is shut down as a result. So fortunately, given our privilege, we're able to continue our work and to think, but this is the exception, and we are in an exceptional space. So welcome nonetheless that you're here, but also some people may be caught up in some of the combination of transport protests and load shedding in Cape Town this morning. So, of course, the turmoil in Cape Town isn't unique to South Africa. We're all living through the effects of what is going on in Russia and Ukraine over the last year. And the most palpable expression of that, of course, is what's happened with inflation. And the more direct impact, of course, is the inflationary consequences for food security and for access to food, let alone nutritional food. And as with many other things, Africa, of course, typically tends to be at the worst receiving end of some of these global dynamics. But as we step off 2022, as I've just alluded to, quite a few people in the room have just returned from Egypt, and we are most grateful that you've still made the effort to be here despite the last 2 weeks. But of course, we also know that, again, COP27 has demonstrated the profound limitations and inadequacies of a global governance system that is simply not suited to address the scale and the complexity of the various multi-crises facing us. And some of the most obvious things, of course, is that you do get these small gains, like the Loss and Damages Fund that has just now been established. But as the report by Shongwe and Stern suggested just before the COP started, that the commitments of Paris for 100 billion per annum for the Global South has not in any way been achieved. And in fact, the actual number is $4 to $5 trillion that's required if we're going to be serious about the consequences of climate change impacts and to respond both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And of course, part of that story is the fact that most of the global north and some countries in the global south continue to dramatically subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And even though the subsidies tapered off during COVID, as this graph shows you, it is very much on the up again. And there's very little to suggest that any of these trends are going to change. And of course, in the last 2 weeks, we've kind of all seen this incredible spectacle of FTX imploding, $6 billion wiped off its valuation in the course of 2-3 days. And more interestingly, the kind of absolutely macabre and surreal stories about how this company was run from a penthouse and kind of a really ridiculous MIT class or classmates kind of playing monopoly with people's lives. But of course, again, symptomatic of a much larger governance failure, again, manifested in, of course, and why the tech market volatility matters is because it's the largest growth sector in the global economy. And what happens in that economy has a profound knock-on effect for all other sectors. But for our purposes, of course, it is particularly emblematic of the governance failures at the global scale. But it's not all doom and gloom, and as Dilip will tell us later, we can also celebrate certain sort of developments that have happened recently, and I haven't yet had the 3 hours because I had to prepare for the conference to go and see it, but it is on the agenda. So Dilip, maybe you can give us. So the great thing about Dilip is he's an avid social media, he reports back to the community and the family, and so it's great to know that he was ready for the release of it. But as I've mentioned, of course, and for those who are not from South Africa, we have blackouts, but we euphemistically call them load shedding. And there must be some Freudian reason for that, which we can get into over coffee. But the point is that we've tried to insulate our discussions and today from the effects of that. And again, just to all the colleagues working on the technical back end, thank you for all the effort around that. But of course, nothing is guaranteed. And over the weekend, my heart sank because it was announced that we are going to load shedding levels 4 or 5. That's like DEFCON. So who knows if the generators can survive that kind of shock. But again, emblematic of so much of what we are wrestling with over the course of the next 3 days in terms of some of the fundamental functions of these network infrastructures and how precarious they actually are, even though they seem to be absolutely solid. And these things all come together in these global fora. And again, just looking back at the G20 summit that happened in Bali a few weeks ago, we saw if you will, sort of a energy transition, as in the Fast and Furious franchise 2, with Indonesia following up on the South African energy transition package that was announced at COP27 and only really assembled and presented at COP27 by President Ramaphosa. But there's something really significant here, because if you look at the 20 billion that has been marshaled for the Indonesian announcement, it speaks to a very different set of relationships and configurations in the global economy and the global governance systems, both in terms of, if you will, the symbolic reference points for where change and leadership is going to come from, but also how there is this desperate attempt to remodel the global financial architecture, and as Mark Sulling will explain tomorrow, in some ways in vain, because there isn't a questioning of the underlying design of that architecture and its systemic dimensions. But this kind of image with the president of the EU in that frame, the president of the US, the president of Indonesia, it tells us a very different story than the stories we've heard and seen until very recently. So my suggestion is that there is something afoot, and it is important to pay attention to these things arising up around us all the time, and with much greater intensity and much greater speed. And so it brings me to this question of why infrastructure. The reason we've kind of gone all nerdy over the next 3 days, as opposed to our 2018 conference, which was, really expansive, is because we think it offers a really interesting conceptual and political opportunity space to recast the intersectional crisis as an opportunity to both imagine, but also to instantiate alternatives. But this is not alternatives with a capital A. We're not so interested in that. We're really interested in understanding how alternatives are always emergent, and how does one read and engage with that emergence as a way of thinking at a more conceptual, theoretical, paradigmatic level. And what that is, where it's going, in our view, is really up for grabs. And so what I think when you look across the panels over the day is that you will see lots of moments and instances where people are grappling with aspects of this. And part of the task that awaits us is to begin to articulate that. And there's lots of people in this room that are, expert at that and have written in that direction and so on. But I think that part of the insistence is that the geographical reference points for that articulation and, if you will, the territorial reference points need to shift. And in that vein, it is so fantastic to have Dilip here with us, who speaks from the oceans, a completely different territorial and relational conception than what is maybe the norm for us as urbanists. But this work has to happen with a perspective into the end of the 21st century. And Africa, and particularly Asia, is at the epicenter of a number of really large and extremely complex trends that are colliding in space. Of course, we hear a lot about the climate emergency, but actually there's 3 environmental issues going on at the same time. It's the climate impacts, it's biodiversity destruction, and of course it is resource depletion. And it is actually the intersection of these 3 things that profoundly curtails what might or might not be possible in terms of different development frameworks and patterns and aspirations. Of course, everyone here is super familiar with the urbanization demographic shifts and how that is anchored in Asia and Africa. But of course, the point we often forget to remember is that what those increases mean and the re-territorializations that's implied is an exponential growth in demand for services and land, right? So we often kind of disconnect the demographic dynamic from what that means sociologically, politically, culturally. It's an emergence of new and more intensified demand structures. And of course, that is highly variegated. Then we've got the sort of related demographic shifts around the youth demographic, which means Africa's labor force will be the largest by 2060 of any world region in the world. And of course, it also means that the stubborn insistence we manifest that we're seeing in Southern Europe and most acutely in Italy these days, that Africans need to stay where they are, is simply not a viable economic or labor market strategy for the future, because the populations and the labor force in the global north, most extremely in Japan, but generally in the global north, are dying off. And they can't really sustain their economies or their societies if there isn't a dramatic shift in labor market thinking over the next while. Again, and the reference I made earlier to the G20 summit, for me, is emblematic of the recognition that the sun is setting in the West, and the sun is undeniably, in a hotter world, rising in the East. And we haven't yet really begun, especially in South Africa and in Anglophone countries, begun to wrestle with what this actually means. I don't understand it. I know it's profound, but I just don't understand it. And again, I think our keynote this morning is going to help us make a little bit of sense of the importance of reading the world differently so that we can begin to engage with some of those questions. And then, of course, the big question of digitization and the way that this will fundamentally and profoundly change the nature of work. And sort of one of my own little engagement with this with my dear friend and colleague, Michael Mendimo, who I don't know if he's here yet this morning, has been to play around with AI-generated images as a way of engaging with questions of visual imaginaries and representations, and I'll show you some of that in a second. But it was just incredible to realize that there are now people in the world that you can source on the web, according to Michael, that simply generate the keywords to be able to produce the AI images. That's their job. They figure out what are the combinations of keywords you need to input into the AI generator to get the render that you're looking for. That's a job now. That's a job. Someone is doing that. Anyway, my mind was blown. Don't know if yours is. But of course, why cities matter and why cities are such an important fulcrum of this is that cities are systems of systems, right? And so if we look at the number of systemic crises, it gives us some sense of the complexity we're dealing with. I've mentioned the ecological ones. The economic ones I've intimated, but at the heart of this is the deepening of multidimensional inequality. And this is both an economic and, of course, a socio-cultural dynamic. And what is significant is that in cities, this really becomes acute, as I'll explain in a second. The other really challenging things we've witnessed and we see in our political landscapes is, of course, social polarization. It's the lack of an imagination about how we will retool and rethink our educational infrastructures to prepare global labor forces for a very different and a new economy. And of course, within all of this, the way in which the mediatization of the world serves as an accelerant for a number of these dynamics. And again, the contestation around what has been happening at Twitter in the last 2 weeks is an important, if you will, instance of some of these dynamics. And then I think politically we're really, really living, obviously, in incredibly scary times. And it doesn't really matter which geography you occupy. And in some ways, if we look at the shit show that was the UK over the last year, it's clear that it seems like the more resources and the deeper the institutional legacies are, the more extreme the absurdity of these political dramas are. And I think some of the stuff that is really difficult to decipher is the role of dark money, right? Is the hijacking of political systems and processes by plutocrats. And what do we do with those things? Because clearly the dissonance between what we typically regard as radical democratic instruments and the realms of aggregation of power and influence that those things operate in are so opaque and so disconnected that, is the way we think about that stuff really still, sufficient? And of course, the Iranian revolution at the moment, again, is an example of just, both the effects and the challenges and the political obstinacy that extremism can generate, but also resistance, of course. Now, again, coming back to our theme of infrastructure in cities and cities at the center of this, is maybe one illustration of particularly the ecological crisis is that if we do consume the cement and the steel and the sand to indeed respond to this urban growth in Africa, we're talking about a 700% increase in resource material use over the next 30 years, right? That's just Africa. And so, again, there are these trend lines, implications of those, and a set of institutions that are simply not geared to either make sense, let alone respond effectively at a policy scale. Another instance of this, of course, as we've, according to the UN, crossed the 8 billion threshold, is that the African labor force is really the only labor force that will continue to expand, but that is happening in a reality of systemic marginalization of the African regional economy. We'll hear a little bit from Carlos Lopez tomorrow about what's the prognosis in terms of shifting that dynamic, in terms of pursuing Agenda 2063. But the underlying issue that is of concern for us is that this labor force is youthful, they're mainly in cities, and they are entering the labor market in a predominantly informal context. And there are no indicators on the horizon that the prospect of any kind of formal, stable, decent paying job will be growing anytime soon, and if anything, that is moving in the other direction. So in some ways, if we kind of, this is one of those AI images. So AI is pretty good at dystopia, I can tell you that. But I think for me, really at the heart of this is to confront this really, really tough question of socioeconomic stunting, right? So if we look at this demographic, and we look at the fact that there's no prospect for political incorporation, for economic incorporation, an educational system that is completely not geared to enable families, households, individuals to access economic opportunity that can vaguely be linked to a dignified life what do we do, right? Where do we go? And these things are systemic in terms of inequality, environmental impacts, and the jobs and income crisis that I've mentioned. And so part of our process has been to question whether the tropes that we deploy in critical urban studies at the moment go far enough, right? Do they help us with the analytics to really respond to this question? And so to be extremely naughty and provocative, I've kind of generated a caricature of what I think critical urban studies kind of adds up to at the moment, just as a provocation. So please shoot me, machete me, kill me, whatever. Feel free, it will be cathartic. But I think, we kind of, for me, this is the menu. We kind of, sort of really believe it's important to elaborate what this planetary racial capitalism rooted in modernism and hypercommodification means spatially, that at the core of that is extreme financialization and speculative real estate markets, and of course, digital platforms is accelerating this. It requires us, and this requires and enables state capture, if you will, through neoliberalization and social polarization, that we can't make sense of that complexity without deep historicization, and we've got an historian as a keynote this morning, so I'm sure that will help us. But this is rooted to a commitment to decolonization. Cultural nuance is everything, especially to foreground subaltern experience and agency, and this then helps us to appreciate the interstitial spaces for resistance and subversion and think alternatives from there, right? So that's very crude, that's rough, that's below the belt a little bit, but let's pretend, okay, that that's kind of the critical project we're all engaged with. And so that's great, and that's important, and that's why the academy exists. But what we're trying to do with the conference is to just suggest that maybe let's also work with the propositional disposition. That if we accept these as starting points, can we also work to elaborate a substantive imaginary about alternatives? That's the first question. And how could we combine grounded critique with building imperfect institutional experiments? And so, in other words, it's not simply about what is not working, but could we also invest in testing out different things, even if they already exist in the real world? And could infrastructure and placemaking hold the key, since they coincide where capital, desire, political power, and competing aspirations collide in space? And so if we take as a starting point the fact that there's been an interesting shift in thinking from sort of the mainstream discourses around whether it's Paris, whether it's the SDGs or Agenda 2063, to kind of foreground a set of policy entry points. And I'm interested in how that potentially then opens up opportunities for thinking about how and where we could locate experimentation. So this is just a menu of some of the parts of the puzzle that requires deep experimentation, deep critique, deep analytical cross-pollination, so that we can begin to build some of it. In our work at ACC, we've suggested that there might be a set of criteria. We can think about these things in relation to the African continent. They're about, obviously, the environmental footprint of investments, about insisting about labor intensivity, thinking about new forms of capital circulation, and thinking optimistically, if you will, or propositionally about how the digital can, in fact, prime different kinds of sensibilities, and thinking very differently about spatiality. We've then tried to elaborate a set of possibilities by building a frame for thinking about what we have, what an environmental alternative might be, what that might mean in terms of ecological infrastructure, and what are the institutional implications. And what this boils down to is a provocation that if we take different economic logics, i.e. at the intersection of the care circular economy enabled by digital platforms, we can radically rethink every single infrastructural sector. Right? And that begins to open up the possibilities of thinking in this propositional way. Now, there's a bit of a lineage to all of this work. Obviously, I'm just kind of just very briefly mentioning these things, not to elaborate them. But they do come from a conversation we started in this building 5 years ago. It was just after the first Wakanda came out, the first Black Panther movie came out. So that's kind of my reference point. And it was the conference that we had And then, of course, at this point, we had absolutely no idea. There was a global pandemic on the horizon. And so in 2019, we worked with UNDP and Dark Matter Labs around an urban innovations event in Harare, which reinforced the importance of this and connecting and with alternative regulatory experiments. There was a big conference in Dakar in literally a week before South Africa shut down for COVID, called Africa Day, where the European Investment Bank and UN Habitat suggested that we need to really think about infrastructure investment and technologies as a site of contestation. COVID happened. We collaborated with ICLEI, which is a partner to the conference, to have the Rise Africa Festival. Very importantly, Kenny, where's Kenny? Kenny Kuipers from Basel University invited us to work with them on the coloniality of infrastructure, Euro-African legacies, and a lot of folk here, I think, participated in that fantastic event, which had to be reinvented, figuring out what COVID meant, and had really interesting formats to it. And then we had a series called Reframe, where we built out that conceptual approach to infrastructure, which also, again, in COVID, had to become a set of webinars, and you can still go and listen to them. They were fantastic, amazing bunch of Africans in those, and they're all on our YouTube channel. And that then informed the next Rise Africa Festival, but also a bunch of research that we did with Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft on what is the financing piece of this, looking at the different infrastructure sectors, sanitation, transport, and so forth. And again, this is on the ACC website. And through this, it was crystal clear to us there was a need to bring together a much broader conversation, on the one hand with academics, but also with the larger family of institutions that are implicated by and engaged with the infrastructure question. And that brings us right up to today. Welcome, Caroline. And so today we have... don't snigger, she's just made a huge trip from Mexico, you know, representing WIGO at their 5-yearly Congress. So welcome. So it was absolutely genuine, Caroline. Well, good to see you. There was nothing. There was nothing to be read into that welcome. So today you've got the programs in your bag, and you will see you are going to be tortured because you're going to want to be in 3 places at the same time. So we're really, really sorry about that, but you know, what can we say? Too many brilliant people decided they want to be part of the event. So as with all good things in life, you're going to have to make choices, and you're going to have to live with your regrets. So the next 2 days is a different event, and some of you may have registered for that. We're hoping a significant crew from this conference will take on the treacherous task of mingling with practitioners. But yeah, so a little bit about why we're here today. So what we're hoping in the broader sense is to simulate and to connect networks of scholars across various geographies and disciplines. We're inviting, and we curated this so that diverse thinking can interface with various ways of cutting into this theoretically, different practices, different policy debates, and of course also thinking right into the humanities and the arts. We've kept the numbers at 150 because we kind of wanted the room not to be fuller than this. We are live streaming this, so if you have colleagues in your universities or in your organizations that want to sort of engage, all the handles will screen in the slides that will be after this talk. And please do that. But as I said in the beginning, the idea is that we want this to be more intimate. And then today could not have been possible without the work of the scientific committee, and then another group of people that they reached out to. We've acknowledged all of them in the conference program, except Dr. Sylvia Cruz, who for some other reason her name fell off. I think we're still bitter that she left ACC. You know, but Sylvia, apologies for that. But thank you so much for your incredible work. And of course, Abdul Malik Simone stepped out of he's somewhere in the room. I did see him this morning, I'm pretty sure. Thanks, Malik, for agreeing to chair the committee. I will shortly introduce Professor Dilip Menon, who will speak to the topic, Drowning Cities, Thinking Urbanism in the Age of Global Warming. And we've structured the day into those different tracks. Again, in the program, in the discussion time, you can circle the ones you're going to. And then we'll end of the day with a closing set of reflections. Now, it would be remiss to not be very frank and honest about the fact that our government is scandalous, that there are a number of African colleagues who wanted to be here, who were not allowed to come because their visas weren't processed professionally and timeously, and they were subjected to completely random and unnecessary discriminatory treatment. And we apologize. It is deeply embarrassing for us as South Africans that our government behaves in this way. And then what was struck us in organizing this event compared to 2018 is just what has happened to air travel post-COVID, right? So of course, from an environmental point of view, that's a good thing that the prices are going up, but it does mean that it kind of selects who has the resources and the infrastructure to come and who doesn't. And we just want to acknowledge that fact. Thirdly, we're really pleased that you've made the effort, because there is something about being able to give someone a hug, touch an elbow, not in a creepy Joe Biden way, but as in good colleagues, know each other, it's okay. And then what we've done is we've tried to, because we know there are limits to speaking in this kind of scale, and also to facilitate a connection between the two conferences, is my colleague Belak Namaya, who is somewhere here, has led the curation of this exhibition, where we try to take what would be a set of very abstract debates and discussions today and really concretize them through 10 specific illustrative examples of emergent instances of sustainable infrastructure on the African continent. But it's been designed in a way for you to be able to kind of follow up after the event. So if we zoom in on that, these are tear-offs that you can take, put in your conference bag, scribble on, but most importantly, there's a QR code on there. So if you want to learn more about the case, you can click through and read the research that was produced by our colleagues, Nesu and Tinashe. And then we're also inviting you to engage with the actual map and to tell us of other things you know about. Write that down. There's a box there. There's stuff there to write with and so on. And put it onto the map so that we can evolve that as a form of crowdsourcing over the next 3 days. And then we've got 2 questions we're posing to you. What does sustainable infrastructure mean to you? And which infrastructure intervention could be and we couldn't find a better word, apology. I won't apologize in a policy conference, but in an academic conference, I have to apologize for game changer, to accelerate sustainable development in African cities. And then lastly, any reflection from the discussions, from interactions, from the exhibition, please put it on that 3rd panel. And again, if you walk outside this, so this is the wall behind the screens, right? It's right at the back. So don't be shy. You get paid to be opinionated, so, give us your opinions. All the practical stuff, we've got individual Wi-Fi logins that's in your delegate bag. So it's only valid for today. If you are attending the next 2 days, you've got to get a new one tomorrow. We've got, not this, but we've got containers in your bags, so please fill up from the water stations. These bottles are only for the speakers, because they would have forgotten to fill up before they speak, because they were too nervous. And then lunch, everything happens in this building, in the basement, kind of, I guess, a floor down. I won't say what level that is, because UCT has a completely obscure floor numbering system across all of its buildings. It's that last hurdle you've got to pass to get your professorial appointment. And then we are asking that panelists and chairs please gather here or in your rooms where the breakaways are going to happen 20 minutes before to upload PowerPoints. And then we also note that there will be voice recordings in the parallel sessions. And this evening, we have nothing formal. It's kind of Netflix and chill without the Netflix. There'll be just, it's lovely weather, and we'll feed you modest food. You can always go for that fancy gourmet thing back at your hotel room or wherever the cool people hang out these days, late in the evening. But yeah, after we finish today, there'll be a moment to hang out and engage. So let me then just thank people who've cross-subsidized this event. So we could persuade these organizations to fund the next 2 days, and then to say, but maybe you also want to be nice with, support the academic project. So that's how you do redistribution. So thanks to all of our partners. We really appreciate it. And this is the superheroes that did the scientific panel. And again, to just acknowledge that Sylvia Cruz's name is not in the program, but highlighted here. And then there's a whole team of people in ACC that have been absolutely remarkable over the last couple of months to make sure everything is going to be the experience that you will have today and the next 2 days. And the exhibition was done in partnership with colleagues at Utrecht University, the Urban Futures team, and I want to just acknowledge them. And then finally to all the track chairs and rapporteurs. And please note, if you're unhappy about a parallel session, speak to the chair, not us. Okay, they had autonomy to curate. So thanks to everyone, that we really appreciate it. So all that remains then is to open up by introducing the wonderful Professor Dilip Menon. I've admired Dilip's work for a long time because, as Cape Townians at UCT, you kind of venture to Gauteng, and if you're really lucky, you get to go to the wiser debates and discussions, right? And I've met Dilip there over the years in different events and workshops and conferences and so on, and I've always appreciated the incredible clarity and generosity and unique perspective that he brings to any debate, any discussion. There's good scholars, and then there's those scholars who they operate in another sphere, right? Like they're just witty, they're knowledgeable, they kind of can talk about anything, they're nice, they, have vices, like the cool people, the really smart and cool people. And I thought we couldn't do better than try and persuade Dilip, even though he would not regard himself as an urbanist. He's a historian, and he's done a tremendous amount of work over his career, and especially in the last decade, to further the ontological critique that we need to think materiality and spatiality differently, and that the oceans might be an opportunity to do that from. And his bio is in the conference back. And last year, I had the privilege of serving on an awards panel with the Falling Walls Foundation in Berlin. And in a global, extremely competitive category, Dilip won the global award for, I don't know what it was exactly, for social science scholar or humanities, I don't know. Anyway, basically, he competed with the best of the best of the best of the world, and he was head and shoulders above the competition. And so it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome Dilip to address us this morning. And in advance, thanks to Parnell, ACC veteran, and backbone to do the response this morning. Thank you so much for your attention. Dilip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. I mean, after years of Zoom meetings, one always asks, can you hear me? Are you there? And so on. So I'll begin with that. But it was wonderful to hear Edgar introduce me. I felt like I was at my own funeral, where people are extraordinarily nice to you, and you're presented as the I mean, the most versatile human being since Adam, who wasn't particularly versatile. But what I'm going to talk about today is really through my experiences of working on the Global South, doing oceanic history, and thinking about knowledge, how to produce knowledge from the Global South. So there's a lot about what you do that I don't know. Right? I mean, it's not something that I directly engage with, so I thank both Edgar and Abdul Malik for inviting me and allowing me to get up to scratch on a lot of urban history, urban policy, which I hadn't been engaging with. So what I'll do here is to try and talk you through a set of images. I hate PowerPoints, and as my former Dean of Humanities always used to say, power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So what I will do is to put up a set of images which I will address indirectly. So it's a bit like the magician's magic trick, right? This kind of misdirection. So by looking at the pretty pictures, I hope to divert your attention away from my talk, which may or may not work out in the way I intend it to. So to begin with, the first image. One of the things that we have become increasingly conscious of over the last decade or more is that we've begun to be aware of something that has always been at the penumbra of our consciousness, the oceans. And increasingly we have begun to recognize that the waters of the ocean are rising, that we are under threat. Global warming is something that has begun to appeal to our children, to a growing generation, just as much as I grew up under the shadow of nuclear war, and I participated in marches for this campaign for nuclear disarmament and so on. Now, this image for me summons up some of the ignorance and the arrogance of the way we relate to water. This is a painting from 1880 from a Indian nationalist painter, Raja Ravi Verma. It's called Rama, the mythical hero Rama of Ramayana, vanquishing the ocean. So you can see Rama standing with a bow and arrow, and Varuna, who is the god of the ocean, with his wives, who seems petrified of the idea of Rama vanquishing him. And at the heart of this image is the idea of dominion over the natural elements. There's also the hubris, the human hubris that governs our existence on this planet, where we see ourselves as figures who've been granted this dominion. And it's there in all our religions, from the Bible through to the multiple texts that we read. And this hubris where we occupy the universe in a kind of masterful way, unaware of the fact that we occupy the universe along with plants and animals and insects and multiple forms of life, and indeed against the forces of nature over which we have little command. This painting was also done at a time of the high noon of nationalism, and India was still a colonized country, and this was a way of portraying native agency, right? So this was a kind of wish fulfillment here, of the idea of a native being able to command the elements when much of agency had been denied by colonialism. But thinking with this image allows us to actually think with a whole series of what we have increasingly come to know as indigenous knowledge. Right? There was a way in which for us indigenous knowledge was something that was left behind in the wake of development. We were committed to that obscure object of desire, modernity, that we wanted to be. We were, as Dipesh Chakravarti put it, constantly in the waiting room of history, desiring to be like Europe, like America, and so on in the global south. So to think back to the multiple stories along the coastlines of the world which engage with the ocean centrally as a fact of existence, where the ocean is woven into the very fabric of human existence. So where I come from, on the southwestern coast of India, and indeed along the coast of India, there are multiple stories of how land came into existence. And land is always seen as coming into existence through a clawing away from the ocean of land. So Kerala, where I'm from, the founding myth of Kerala has this figure called Parashurama, who spends his life in retribution. He slays 21 generations of warriors and so on, and then overcome with grief and guilt, throws his axe, the bloody axe, into the ocean. The ocean retreats in horror, unable to bear the weight of this crime, and that is how that land is formed, the land of Kerala. It's a story of sin, it's a story of redemption, it's also a story of hubris. And these are the themes that I wish to keep running through this talk, where the idea of reclaiming land from the ocean is also something that is very perilous. It is very contingent, that the ocean can take away what it has given you. And this is something that we are seeing increasingly along the coast. And we'll get on with the story. What the ocean gives, the ocean can take away: tsunamis, typhoons, and so on, which have now become an annual and recurring feature of our lives with global warming. Suvendrini Perera, the Sri Lankan geographer, asked the plungent question of what if the ground beneath our feet turns out to be water? Right? And this is something that we have to think about. It's a plungent question where we are no longer dealing with ideas of terra firma, but terra infirma, right? This kind of fluid. But what we need to address is this disconnect between the actual conditions of our existence and the way we relate to it. How often do we think about the ocean and nature in our reflections on infrastructure, on cities? The story is that of a kind of slightly dyspeptic engagement with states and with contingent forms of governance, but the idea that we need to think globally about infrastructure, and that infrastructure is really the infrastructure that is built against nature, against the oceans, is something that we need to think about. Staying with this idea of indigenous stories, the Yedinji myths in northern Australia are hugely important because you have these stories that have been retained over 10,000 years, over 300 generations. This is important to remember. We are creatures of the text, right? We tend to see oral histories as something that exists on the margins of our imagination, but there are studies done of the Yedinji myths where the Yedinji myths reiterate the idea that the coastline in Australia was once where the barrier reef stands. So Australia extended up to the Great Barrier Reef. And Nicholas Reed's work, which I read for this talk, shows, Nicholas Reed is an Australian linguist. He found 21 such examples of stories about sea level rise. But what is crucial here is most of these stories record events that were noticeable in individual lifetimes, that the sea was receding or advancing and claiming land in people's lifetimes. The question we have to ask is, are we at that point right now? Right? And if we are at that point, are we recognizing it? And this is an important thing to think about. The next image that I want to show you is one of my favorite images. When I came across this at the Kochi Biennale around 4 years ago, it was that wonderful English word of horripilation, where your hair stands on end, right? So this is the image by the Swiss installation artist Marie Velarde. It's from her work called Atlas des Îles Perdues, 2107, the Atlas of Lost Islands, 2107. What she draws are islands across the ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian. Some of these islands exist, some have vanished, and some will vanish. By 2107, none of these islands will be islands anymore. They'll be submerged. And the reason for the horripilation was, for in one moment, in one glance, I saw the past, present, and future all at once. And this is the power of this image in this room of what is called Klein blue. The walls were painted in Klein blue, the same blue that's used for the covers of the Fitzcarraldo editions, those of you who are interested in these things. But what is interesting is that while you have this idea of Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, which is the result of the heuristic hubris of academics, the oceans are continuous. It's just one body of water, right? To which we give different names depending on where we are, and when they will rise as one. And this is what the photographer Gideon Mendel, the South African photographer Gideon Mendel, has reminded us through a series of photographs called Drowning Worlds, where he photographs people in their houses standing in water up to their necks from Thailand through to Norway. There is no global north here. There is no global south here. When the waters rise, we are all imperiled. And this is the question that we need to think about. The interesting thing for me, I mean, for most of you who do urban history, this might come as information you know already, but 53%, that's a majority of the global population, live in coastal areas in over 4,285 coastal cities. This came as a startling fact to me because it's not something that I'd engaged with. Globally, around 145 million people live 3 feet or less above the current sea level. So you can see where the story is going. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as you know, has said that water levels, sea levels will rise by around 16 to 25 inches by the year 2100. This is the year 2107. Maldives, the islands of Maldives could lose 77% of its land area by 2100. The Pacific Island cities are the ones most at risk, and you have the category of ocean cities, which they talk about with regard to the Pacific Ocean, where urban landscapes and seascapes meet, right? Some places, people are living just 1 meter away from the coast, and sea level, they are at 1 meter above sea level. So you can imagine what even a rise of a meter would do to many of these inhabitations. So across China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Egypt in particular, Alexandria, as you know, is one of the most threatened cities. What we shall see as a result of this is a vast global migration. And this is something that we shall have to contend with. As people move away from the coast towards already overburdened cities where infrastructure is threatened. And Edgar, of course, mentioned that at Cape Town, you're fearing level 4 of ESCOM. In Joburg, we've been living with level 4 and 5. And I've been working between my home and my office. As the electricity goes off here, I go to my office, and then I move back again. And of course, the urban legend is that at level 15, ESCOM will come and blow out the candles in your house, right? And so, I mean, there are many terrors that are awaiting us. So this question of this migration, the global migration, those of you who have read Amitav Ghosh's recent novel, Gun Island, he talks about the presence of Bangladeshis in vast numbers in Venice, 2 cities separated by the oceans. As Bangladesh gets submerged, as the mangrove forests, the Sundarbans, get submerged, they migrate to Venice, and Amitav Ghosh goes to Venice and finds himself talking in Bengali to the new natives of Venice. And so we're talking about a migration that is not only going to be inland, it's going to be global, and this is something we shall have to contend with in our cities. But how are we addressing this question, right? This question of this vast migration that we shall see in the future. This is a floating barrier against refugees, right? 2015, we saw the remarkable phenomenon of Syrian migrants walking across the water, the contemporary miracle of our times. I mean, we have heard that Christ walked on water, but these are Syrian migrants who actually did, because if you've read Ai Weiwei's wonderful book, Human Flow, and where he interviews over 600 people, right, migrants, officials, and so on, 90% of those who crossed the Mediterranean did not know how to swim. Right? Now, this is a terrifying fact for me because I don't know how to swim. I have a pool in my house which I haven't stepped into. Right? So here you're thinking about the kind of migration that does not brook natural obstacles. Right? These are people who literally walked across the water in the hope of getting to Europe. And what you had on the coastline was the emergence of a very particular kind of refugee infrastructure, right? Interim, contingent, which included accommodation, healthcare, and of course, incarceration, right? How do you imprison people? How do you work with that idea of the citizen that is branded into our brain? Edgar spoke about the visa regimes that don't allow fellow Africans to come to our country, right? And these are legitimate, people who want to attend conferences, for God's sakes. They're not like migrants looking for opportunity, economic opportunity, taking away people's jobs, and so on and so forth. So this refugee infrastructure is a category that we shall have to contend with, again, with global warming. In 2020, Greece created these floating barriers of nets on the border with Turkey in the Aegean Sea. The pylons were sunk. You can think about the incredible amount of expense involved in this. Pylons were sunk into the ocean floor to create 1.1 meter high walls with flashing lights and so on, the latest tech. around €500,000 was spent on these nets, which are now lying rather despondent and unused along the coast. Right? So when we think about the ocean, we are also thinking about the ways of human movement. Over 40,000 years, when the first anatomically modern human beings began their movement out of the African continent and end up in Polynesia, for example. So to take a step back, or many steps back, or a huge step back, to ideas about lost worlds, right? Drowned worlds. And this is not as far back as we think. This could very well be our future, right? This is not something from the past. So here, Atlantis is an image that you're familiar with. There is also the idea of the lost continent of Lemuria, which was something in the late 19th and early 20th century, the idea of the catastrophic movements of the Earth's surface, which created this space called Lemuria, which then, from where there was a vast dispersal of animals and humans and so on, and the legend of Kumari Kandam, which is a Tamil myth. So I shall try and bring all of these together. This list of drowning cities, right? It's not just Atlantis, Lemuria, and Kumari Kandam. Jakarta is already drowning. There's a new capital for Indonesia. Lagos, Houston, Bangkok, New Orleans, Calcutta, Mumbai. By 2050, the idea is that large parts of these cities will be underwater. Venice, Rotterdam, I mean, we're not thinking, as I said, global north, global south, same difference. There is a way in which when the waters rise, they're not going to take into account less developed and more developed countries and so on and so forth. It is in this moment that you have the surfacing of this idea of drowned civilizations. So if you read the literature on global warming, cities, and so on, increasingly Atlantis is resurfacing. Because Atlantis is no longer the past, it's a possible future. And this, for me, is interesting as a historian, because Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher and literary critic, has this idea of Jetztzeit, of now time, where history is not a continuous flow. History is a reaching back into a past in a moment of danger to seize an image. And this is the image of Atlantis that has come back to us and presents itself to us as our future. And amidst questions of an infrastructure for a watery future, nostalgia has already begun to set in for what we are about to lose. Right? And the idea of homes that are homes which are civilizations, our literary attainments, our economic attainments, which will soon be consigned to watery graves. For us, the most compelling image, I mean, if one of our students did a dissertation on contemporary art, and over 60% of the artworks that address the world at present refers to the melting of the Arctic ice caps. Multiple installations, I mean, think about Mari Velarde's work as well, but multiple installations which record the sounds of glaciers cracking, the images that now every child, even my children, know of the stranded polar bears and so on. The idea here is that of drowning civilizations, and so what does it mean to think back to Atlantis, think back to Lemuria and so on? The idea of Atlantis comes to us from Plato, from 380 BC, from his texts Timaeus and Critias. Atlantis is a mighty power that challenges Athens. Athens, of course, represented the acme of civilizations. Atlantis and its hubris challenges Athens, but Atlantis is submerged beneath the waves, right? That's what we know. Right? Now, this seemingly seems like a story about the triumph of good over evil and so on, but it's important to remember that in the story of Atlantis, even as Atlantis is submerged, Athens is destroyed by an earthquake. Nobody survives that, right? None of the cities survive it. Ancient Athens is destroyed at the same time. And for us to imagine that only the coastal cities are somehow going to be affected by global warming is a lack of imagination. It's a profound lack of imagination that allows us to have an edge to what we think. But if we are thinking with the world as a whole, ethically, the fate of others is connected to us. And it is a suspect view, right? Athens and Atlantis destroyed at the same time. It's also empirically wrong, because there is the idea of the common fate that we need to think about, a common form of existence. And it's interestingly enough, it's Hollywood thought about this very early. One of the things about doing research for keynotes is that you get onto the net and then a vast world opens up. And then suddenly, this, as in the Benjaminian summoning up an image in a moment of danger, suddenly I thought of one of the worst movies that I ever saw, a hugely expensive movie made in the 1990s called Waterworld, right? 1995, some of you I can see the trauma in the room. Those of you who've seen it, right? So, and this starred Kevin Costner, who danced with wolves and so on. Now, the story of Waterworld is that by 2500 of the Christian era, sea levels rise over 7,600 meters. I mean, this is Hollywood. IPCC is conservative, 16 to 25 inches, and then the imagination stops short. This is risen by 7,600 meters. Every continent is underwater. The remains of human civilization are on atolls, right? So it's an archipelagic imagination, right, that's come up, where you have these scattered atolls of human civilization. I won't tell you the rest of the story, because I think this is enough trauma to begin with. But you think about, and when I had this image come to me, I started thinking about the lessons that I studied at university, when I was thinking about the evolution of the Earth, of geology, and I was reminded of the works of Charles Lyell, the famous geologist of the 19th century, and I came across this wonderful and apposite quote, where in that the late 18th and early 19th century, as you know, was governed by ideas of catastrophism and the Earth being created through a series of catastrophes. Charles Lyell's idea, you have Wegener, the continental drift. There's a whole evolution of ideas, but Charles Lyell does this wonderful quote where he says, and I quote here, "Every spot which is now dry land has been at sea at some former period, and every part of the space now covered by the deepest ocean has been land." And I thought to myself again, how resonant this is for our times, where there are these constant reminders for us land lovers, for us terrestrial creatures, that our triumph over water has been a temporary one. Our triumph over nature is not complete. And Rama vanquishing the ocean with which we began is a mere, as they say, a pipe dream. So loss, catastrophe, the end of the world. I mean, I'm sounding like one of these evangelist preachers, but the end of the world is here. So you have in the Tamil imagination, southern India, in the Tamil imagination, you have the idea of Lemuria. The idea of Kumari Kandam, which brings together the idea of Atlantis and Lemuria, of an entire civilization that was lost. And that civilization was, of course, the finest. It had the best literature, it had the best poets, it had the best political order, multiple treatises on everything ranging from mathematics to philosophy. But central to this is the idea of these texts. If you go back to the first millennium of the Christian era, in the Tamil text, you have the idea of kadal kol, of the seizure by the ocean, to take you back to the Yedinji myths of the Aboriginals, which I spoke about, that in every literature buried in it, every literature of every nation living by the coast is this idea of the haunted by the fact that the ocean can take back what it has given us. So the idea of kadal kol, or seizure by the ocean, and this idea emerged again in 2004 when the tsunami struck, right? Southern India, Sri Lanka, as you know, was devastated. And so the historian Sumati Ramaswamy, who's a duke who works on these issues, calls it the dialectic between the antediluvial, as you know, before the flood, and the antediluvial, right? The people who resist the very idea of a flood. So the idea of the antediluvial is something that is built into the Christian biblical imagination. So when we think about this, I mean, this is the way the way will, if you think about those lines of Eliot, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. But this is the way the world will end, not with a bang, but with denial, right? And that's probably where we need to be thinking about very crucially. Finally, infrastructures and dreams of the future, counter-imaginations for the future, as Edgar was suggesting. The idea of blue urbanism. So I began looking for signs of hope on the net, right? These days one looks for everything on the net, including where to buy multiple things on Amazon. But this is the image of the Venus Project. And I'll speak about the Venus Project. I'll also talk about the Eco-Atlantic City in Vegas. In Lagos. There you go, Vegas. So to go back to the image that I began with, of Rama vanquishing the ocean, fighting against the sea, reclamation. This has been the real estate solution to our engagement with the ocean, to take back and recreate as real estate. You all know of Palm Island in Dubai. And you also know of the Eco-Atlantic City on the Lagos waterfront, where there's the Great Wall of Lagos that has been created. The Great Wall, as we know, is an idea that goes back to Donald Trump. No, sorry, it goes back to China, but then, so the idea of creating these walls against humans, creating these walls against nature, where the Great Wall of Lagos is really to prevent storm surge, to prevent erosion, control barriers, the creation of land from water, the ultimate hubris of the human engagement with population. And there is a large literature on this idea of speculative urbanism, and speculative in both its senses, speculative as in financialization, profit, and so on, but also the sense of speculative urbanism in the sense of imagining a different kind of city, imagining a different kind of infrastructure, perilous, of course. I mean, something that is hugely contingent, which depends centrally on what has also been called climate apartheid, right? The fact that each of these ventures, whether it's the Atlantic City project or Palm Island, rests on an unconscionable eviction of people. The pretense that there are no people who live along coastlines, that this is terra nullius in some sense, that is being appropriated for capital. So the Lagos Atlantic City had the eviction of over 80,000 inhabitants, right? It's a vast number of people who had to be removed. And there is a very precarious coastal urbanism that's been created. And this is the work of Ben Mendelsohn that I'm referencing here. A very precarious coastal urbanism where the question of infrastructure is built on sand, right? Remember the quote from the Bible, the wise man built his house upon the rock, right? But our cities are built on sand, right? A biblical injunction against that exists. So the question of infrastructure, around 40 million cubic meters of sand had to be dredged in order to create Atlantic City. And this question of infrastructure, this question of sand, when you think about the expansion of Singapore, which has expanded over 20% since its formation, it has resulted in the devastation along Southeast Asia and Vietnam, Indonesia. Sand has been imported. We know that Saudi Arabia is importing sand. Now, that's an irony for you, right? Because the sand in Saudi Arabia is not fit for construction, as you all know. It's too fine. So they have to get sand from elsewhere. The desert needs sand, as it were. And here again, we go back to indigenous cosmology. So, for example, if you think about Nigeria, you have Yoruba cosmology, which talks about the earth originating when a minor deity is commanded by the creator, Olodumare, to convert the primordial sea into habitable ground. So here we're back to Rama vanquishing the ocean. We're back to contemporary speculation. And these ideas and images have been around us for a while. This constant imagination of getting land back from the ocean. And alongside this is a kind of ethical dilemma. Even as these cities are being built, Abdul Malik has written about the idea of a blank slate. Right? That you imagine these territories as being devoid of human habitation. And this reclamation has involved not only the dredging technology, the dredging has become the metaphor, so to speak, of urban creation along the coast. But at the same time, there's this imagination of a blank slate as vast numbers of people, even in Indonesia, are just being removed from coastlines, right? And the idea is that of building seawalls and so on and so forth. And it's speculative urbanism also in the sense of, as the economist Frank Knight put it, where there is a confusion between the idea of uncertainty and risk. Right? Now, to explain uncertainty and risk, we must resort to that great theoretician of our time, Donald Rumsfeld, who talked about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Right? So that's the difference between certainty and risk, where this kind of urbanism is built on the idea of a controllable future. Right? It's about uncertainty rather than risk. So what I'll show you are these various utopian imaginations. The talk has been generally dystopic, so to give you some hope, let me show you this. Right? So this is the Venus Project. The Venus Project is imagined as a global network of cities in the sea. Now, you might well ask, in contemporary South African lingo, we ask, what have they been smoking, right? So a global network of cities in the sea which mines untapped resources in the sea without disturbing the ecology. I mean, the prose that describes these projects is so wonderfully disconnected from any notion of reality, where these constructions are anchored to the ocean floor, and you think, the ocean floor is not like 10 meters below sea level, right? And flotation chambers, a whole set of, so I entered a new world, as it were, in reading about a lot of this. And a lot of the ideas behind the Venus Project are based on the ideas of a man called Jacques Fresco, who I would recommend you read. He has this idea of the resource-based economy, shortened to RBE for those with attention problems. And the idea of the resource-based economy is that within these cities, right, which will come up on the ocean, which none of us will be able to afford. We are all humble academics. In fact, one of the sites that I was reading talked about the wholesale removal of fisher people and the building of houses along the coast which would be low cost and affordable, starting from $250,000 upwards. And I thought, these are effing rich fishermen we are talking about, right? So Jacques Fresco and the idea of the resource-based economy, and I quote, all goods and services are available to all people without the need for means of exchange, such as money, credit, or barter. So we are back in the future of primitive communism, right? That's the idea that is at the heart of it. There is also the idea of seasteading, of floating nations. And this, again, there is a considerable literature on this. I had the misfortune of reading this book by this author called Joe Quirk for this keynote. And the title of this book is extremely evocative. And How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from the Politicians. What more could one ask for? It would be, it would be really grumpy on my part not to want all of this. And the people who put forward these ideas call themselves evangelists, right? The evangelists for the ocean. For those of you who are nerds and interested in what is the feminine form of evangelist, it's evangeless, right? Which hasn't entered the dictionary as yet, but is there on the net for you to look up. The other city that's being planned, apart from this Venus project, is in Korea, which will, and in Busan, and this is starting, right? This is in the imagination. In Busan, in 2023, you have Oceanics City, which is going to be coming up, and construction will start as of 1st January, so it's imminent, it's going to happen. It's a floating world of hexagonal islands. Now, that was Eco-Atlantic City, Lagos for you. This is Oceanic City, Busan. Wouldn't you like to live here? So it's a floating world of hexagonal islands, again, which is ecologically sound, and all the things that I've been talking about, remove poverty. Of course, it has a jail. It's important to remember this. The future cities are going to be people, but there will always be the bad egg, right? So you have to put away. in Panama, the world's first, and this is something that really blew my mind, Edgar. I mean, in Panama, the world's first 3D printed smart floating home with 3D printed coral reefs, right, is now operational. These homes, again, are for the throwaway price of between $200,000 to $800,000, easily affordable by people in this room. And the fact is that this kind of, if you start looking at the ways in which people have been imagining how to contend against global warming, there are many such solutions coming up like this. And you wonder, what is the sense of disconnect? What is the sense of hubris? What is this lack of imagination that governs, where the financialization is the capitalism of our times? It is sheer speculation, generating money from nothing. I mean, we talked about the collapse of cryptocurrency, and these are these multiple fantasies of the future with which we are addressing the question of infrastructure, which is an exigent question. It's an exigent question, which is also an ethical question, right? What happens to people whose lives are at risk? So what I will stop with, that's the Maldives Floating City project, which is being designed by the Dutch Docklands. You'll find many such, and lovely multicolored homes. But what I want to end with is this question for anyone studying urbanisms. This is from Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable. And I'll just read it out, and I will stop there. In a substantially altered world, when sea level rise has swallowed the Sundarbans and made cities like Kolkata, New York, and Bangkok uninhabitable, when readers and museum goers turn to the art and literature of our time, will they not look first and most urgently for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? And when they fail to find them, what should they, what can they do other than conclude that this era, which so congratulates itself on its self-awareness, will come to be known as the time of the great derangement? And that indeed is the message for us in this conference as we think about the future of cities. Are we going to be victims of that great derangement or not? Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. And colleagues, hello. I'm intrigued as we enter into our post-pandemic practice that there are some things that we change, and then there are other things that we leave behind, and then there is some kind of evolved practice. And in a way, our participation in the conference now is a form of evolved practice. Out there are people who are joining us, who are engaging, who are listening, who are thinking and wanting to respond. And there are traditions of academic practice that we hold dear, and we've seen some of those today. We've met, we've had coffee, we've had a contextual discussion of what we're going to do, including instructions of where to get coffee and where to go to the loo. No, you didn't do that because we're in South Africa, not England, right? But there are loos out there for those of you who want them, and there won't be a fire drill. But what I think is really important in the tradition of the academic conference is the idea of the keynote speech. And the reason for that is that it's here, as we've heard today and we've seen today, to provoke, to refresh, to inspire, to remind us of the composite parts that the scholarly imagination and the scholarly craft can bring together to rupture, to change, to reinforce, to distill ideas in particular kinds of ways. And Dilip, there's another academic tradition which I'm not quite sure why we've held on to in the same sort of way, which is the response. And there are a couple of traditions in the response. One of them is to ask really difficult questions and to be extremely critical. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going down that track. The other is to summarize, but given that Dilip already said he's not going to do a PowerPoint presentation, I'm certainly not going to do a summary of what I think was vast, wide-ranging, stimulating, exactly as it should be in a keynote presentation. But what I do want to do is to invoke very quickly that tradition of the response, which is simply to highlight a few of the things which I think are important for us to think about. And some of those are content points and some are process. And perhaps some are even personal, because what is embodied in the voice of the scholar as opposed to the voice of any other person making a contribution to the knowledge of our times in a context of a world of drowning cities. And I think for me, what was really important, and it's a thanks both to you and Edgar, actually to the scientific committee, for conceiving of a keynote that addresses perhaps the critical issue of our day, the scientific issue of our day, what's been debated for the last 2 weeks intensively in Egypt, but to do so through the lens of a historian, to celebrate the contribution of the humanities, to embrace the relevance of the past to the present. And for me, that is absolutely fundamental, because it's that kind of agility, it's that kind of grounding that gives us the reach, that gives us the capacity, that gives us the elasticity to deal with the complexity of the problems that face us. So that seems to me to be perhaps one of the most important things to take from there. And then perhaps the second is the importance of the academic register. What do I mean by that? I mean that the way that we will talk today doesn't have to be the same as the way that we may talk tomorrow, or when one engages with civil society or with a policymaker or with a resident. There's an importance to the notion of abstraction. There's an importance to the imagery and the interpretation and the insight that one can derive from reading and seeking out not just the net, but also the other wonderful rich sources that are brought to bear, and understanding those legacies of ideas and the relevance of the wisdom of people who have written from other places, in other ways, around other kinds of problems. And so I really valued that refreshment, if you like, that topping up of our it's not our conceptual apparatus, it's just the way, the words, the framing, the formatting, which takes you to a different kind of language.